Hey guys, this is Chris. I just wanted to make a quick video about the role of art in RPGs. Maybe a better way of framing the question that I want to explore in this video is, to what extent does art make an RPG better or worse? I feel like most people lie on a spectrum when it comes to this question. On the one side or one extreme, you have folks who really strongly appreciate good art, and the art might be enough reason for them to invest in a system. Like, they may not even read a blurb about the system. They will just purchase a game book or a supplement on the basis of the cover or the art that they've encountered. On the other extreme, you have folks who, they don't care if the rules that they're reading are in a Google Doc. They don't care if there's no images whatsoever. All they care about is the quality of the writing and the design of the mechanics. That's all that they value. By the way, when I talk about art in an RPG, I am referring to the art that is within a core rule book or official supplemental materials. I'm not referring to stuff like miniatures or terrain or things that are basically very much variable and dependent on what the player brings to the experience, right? That's not something that the game designer can really control for the most part. To further develop this question, I want to compare two RPGs that I love a great deal. The first RPG that I want to look at is Dungeon Crawl Classics. DCC is renowned and very highly regarded for the quality of its art. It has a very specific art style that is inspired by early D&D, like D&D in the 70s and 80s. And I think that they've actually hired a lot of the artists that worked on iconic and famous D&D modules to contribute to not only the DCC core rulebook, but many of the modules that DCC is famous for. I have to admit that half the reason why I bought this core rulebook was because I just love the art. I mean, I just find this cover right here so compelling and so evocative. Like, just looking at the art on this cover makes me want to peruse the rest of this book. And I can just open up to almost any random page in this book and I'll find something visually striking. Like, just this picture here of a dude looking at a goblet with a mouth on it. Like, that's very weird. That's really strange. And it's also very visually interesting. And you can open, just so much stuff on every page. Like, I think that you could really just purchase this book as a kind of D&D or RPG art book and get value from it that way. The reason why I want to sort of focus on this book and focus on DCC is because I think it illustrates some of the value that art can bring to an RPG. There are two things that the art in DCC does for DCC. The first thing that art does for DCC is that it gives you, the reader, a very good sense of what DCC is all about. When you look at the art in this book, it's weird, it's bizarre, it's evocative, it's interesting, and you are able to get a sense that this is a gonzo game. This is a game that sort of focuses on and zooms in on the weird aspects of fantasy storytelling. And the game is very true to that. Mechanically, the game is all about that. This is reflected in all sorts of mechanics in DCC. I won't go into too much detail, but the point is that the art does a great job of reinforcing what the game is about and communicating to the player and to the reader what the game is about. The second way art helps or brings value to DCC is that it really helps players and judges. Judges, by the way, is DCC's term for GMs and DMs. It really helps people who are encountering this game or engaging with this core book visualize stories and campaigns and adventures that they could be experiencing with this rule set. I'm going to turn to a particularly evocative example that I like in the core rule book. There's this page right here. It's within the equipment section of the DCC core book, and it has, I don't know if you can really see the art here, but it's a really evocative and hyper detailed depiction of an armory, or blacksmithy filled with equipment. And just looking at this particular bit of art places me mentally in that armory, and I can just envision my players walking around this armory and happening upon cursed items, and immediately I'm in the game without playing the game. And I think that really good art in an RPG does that. It helps you envision how your game experience might look like. I think this kind of thing is super important for the folks who design and write RPGs because unlike video games or board games where you can watch a game trailer or you sit down and look at a board game and you see the board and various components, it's a lot harder to know what the experience of playing a particular game will be like. Like you really don't have a lot to go on except for word of mouth and the art and a few textual descriptions, but the actual experience of sitting down and playing Vampire the Masquerade or Stars Without Number or DCC or Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, like you don't really have a gauge of what that will be like until you play it. But art gets you closer to a mental model of what that experience will be. Now, the second RPG that I want to talk about is my favorite RPG, which is Stars Without Number by Kevin Crawford. Stars Without Number is a science fiction role-playing game. It's built off the chassis of, I believe it's Mulvey Cook, basic D&D. So the core of it is Dungeons and Dragons, but it's been adapted and revised by Kevin Crawford, and it also has a ton of GM and sandbox tools. It's an amazing RPG. I'll stop selling it because I can talk for hours about why this is an amazing RPG, but I wanted to contrast Stars Without Number to DCC because unlike DCC, which is invested very heavily in its art and makes art a very key way it communicates ideas to the people that are reading its core rulebooks or modules, Stars Without Number, I think, has a much more understated approach to art. As you can see from the cover, it's a pretty cover. It's gorgeous. Nature is gorgeous, right? This is a depiction of a star field, and it looks great, but it's not artistic in the same way that DCC is artistic. In a way, it's a bit more generic. And while there is art in this book, there's a lot less art than there is in DCC, and the art that you do see is, again, generic. Again, it's technically competent. Like, you look at it and you think, this is like impressive on a purely technical level, but unlike DCC, which has a very clear kind of artistic bias and is trying to say something with its art, the art in Stars Without Number is, it looks super cool, but again, it's like I kind of don't know what to make of it in a way. Like I'm having trouble talking about it because even though it's cool, I mean, look, this is an awesome mech. The art isn't terribly consistent throughout the book, and it doesn't appear to be sending a very cohesive message about what the game is about, except that the game is about generic science fiction. So in a weird way, the fact that the art is technically competent, but not necessarily, strongly opinionated like the art in DCC, reinforces the message that Stars Without Number is a generic science fiction game. And I have to admit that I'm not as much a fan of the art in Stars Without Number, this revised edition, as I am of the art in DCC. However, Stars Without Number is still my favorite RPG. So clearly, the fact that the art, isn't spectacular, isn't significantly impeding my enjoyment of this game. I still really love Stars Without Number. So maybe the takeaway, from examining this book is that as long as you meet like a baseline, criteria of art, most people won't mind. As long as it's not actively bad, most people, won't hold it against you. So to wrap up this video, I guess I can say that for myself at least, art is very important to my enjoyment of an RPG. It really plays a big role in helping me understand what the RPG is going for, and it really sells me on the game. Now, I think that if your art isn't, spectacular, I don't think that's a huge detriment to a game, as long as the art is not actively bad. Funnily enough, the preceding edition of Stars Without Number had some pretty bad art. The art in general, I mean, some of the art was quite good, but some of it was really not good at all. In fact, I might put up an image here of there's a depiction of a psychic in the first edition of this game that every time I looked at it, it brought me out of the game because it was so actively bad. Happily, Kevin has really sort of stepped up the game for this edition, but that's the danger of having actively bad art. If the art isn't good, and again, this is subjective, every person is going to have their own preferences, but if the art is like pretty shoddy, then I think that it actually gets the person out of the game. They're reading the core rulebook, they're getting invested in the system, they're getting excited about the system, then they encounter something that's not visually appealing, and it sort of, it taps the brakes a bit in terms of whatever enjoyment they're experiencing as they're reading this core rulebook. So I think art matters, but I think that as long as you meet a certain baseline in terms of presentation and in terms of art, you'll be okay. It doesn't have to be, this ode to classic D&D art like DCC. As long as you meet that baseline, you'll be fine. So those are my thoughts. That's my opinion. I would love to sort of get your opinion as a viewer of what you think the value of art is in RPG. What's your personal feelings on this? Do you disagree with me? Do you agree with me? I would love to hear your opinion. So thank you for watching, and I hope this was interesting.